The sunlight filtered weakly through the lace curtains of Margaret's sitting room, casting pale shadows over the framed photographs lining her mantelpiece. Each photo held a story: birthdays, graduations, her late husband's shy smile at their wedding, moments she replayed in her mind like favorite songs. The house, though old and creaky, was the heartbeat of her life. It smelled of lavender, books, and the faint scent of her husband's aftershave that still lingered in the walls. That morning, Daniel stood near the window, his posture restless. "Mom," he began softly, his voice too careful, too measured. "You can't live alone anymore. It's not safe. Sophie and I have been talking, and we've found a better place for you. A beautiful care home just outside the city. Peaceful gardens, nurses on call, everything you need." Margaret looked up from her knitting, her eyes searching his face. "A better place?" she repeated, tasting the word slowly, unsure whether to be comforted or afraid. Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll love it, Mom. It's for your own good." She wanted to believe him. Of course she did. He was her only child, the boy she'd raised on love and late-night stories, the boy who used to promise, "I'll always take care of you, Mom." Now, looking at him in his expensive coat and distracted expression, she wasn't sure she recognized that boy anymore. Sophie entered the room briskly, her perfume sharp, her tone clipped. "We've already started packing some of your things," she said, forcing a smile. "You won't need much. Just clothes and your essentials. They have everything else there." Margaret's heart sank a little. "I'd like to see this place before we decide anything," she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course," Daniel said quickly, avoiding her eyes. "We'll drive you there tomorrow. You'll see how nice it is." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in her armchair, wrapped in her husband's old blanket, staring at the photos around her. She whispered to his picture, "John, they say they're taking me somewhere better. But better for who?" The walls didn't answer. Only the clock ticked in reply. The next morning came too soon. The car ride was long and silent, broken only by Sophie's occasional hum of impatience and Daniel's short responses on his phone. Margaret watched the world blur past the window, her familiar street, the corner bakery, the church where she'd sung hymns for 40 years. Each landmark slipped away like a farewell. When the car finally stopped, Margaret expected warmth, comfort, maybe even kindness. But the better place loomed ahead, a gray, square building surrounded by high fences. The name on the signboard was cheerful enough: Sunnyvale Care Residence. Yet there was nothing sunny about it. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the halls echoed with television noise and distant, tired voices. A nurse approached with a polite but distant smile. "Welcome, Mrs. Bennett. We've been expecting you." Expecting her. The phrase made her feel like a parcel being delivered, not a mother being cared for. Daniel kissed her cheek quickly. "You'll be fine, Mom. We'll visit often." His words floated, insincere and hurried. Sophie was already turning to leave, glancing at her watch. Margaret tried to smile. "You promise?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course," Daniel said, not meeting her eyes. She watched them walk away, their silhouettes framed in the doorway before disappearing entirely. A nurse led her to a small, sterile room. A bed, a chair, a window that looked out onto nothing but a parking lot. Margaret sat down heavily, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. For a long time, she just stared at the empty space where her son had stood. Then she whispered into the stillness, "You said it was a better place, Daniel. But you never said for who." And in that moment, a quiet ache bloomed in her chest. The first sting of a truth she wasn't ready to face, but would soon understand all too well. The days that followed were a slow blur of sameness, the kind that numbs both body and soul. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the narrow window of Margaret's new room, landing on the beige walls that felt more like boundaries than comfort. Breakfast was served at 7 sharp, always lukewarm porridge, and tea that tasted faintly of metal. Then came activity hour, where frail voices echoed in the recreation hall, singing songs from a past that most of them no longer remembered clearly. Margaret tried to find solace in small things. A patch of light that warmed her blanket, a kind smile from Nurse Lila, or the rare days when she could smell the roses blooming outside the courtyard. But the silence of abandonment pressed heavier with each passing day. Daniel's visits became shorter, then sporadic. At first, he'd call twice a week, his tone brisk, his words rehearsed. "Mom, are you settling in okay? They're treating you well, right?" But even those calls soon dwindled. Sophie never called at all. The last time Margaret saw her was through the screen of Daniel's phone, waving half-heartedly from their living room. It was during one of those lonely afternoons, while sitting by the window, that Margaret overheard two nurses talking outside her door. Her son sold the old house fast, one said, lowering her voice. "Got a good price, I heard. Poor lady, she probably doesn't even know." The other nurse sighed. "You'd be surprised how often that happens. Families can be cruel." The word struck Margaret like a slap. Sold. Her heart thudded painfully. She pressed her trembling hands together, trying to steady her breath. She remembered the stack of documents Daniel had brought her to sign before she left. "Just hospital consent forms," he'd said. The ink had smudged slightly under her shaky signature. She hadn't asked questions then. She didn't want to believe her own son could lie to her. But now the truth whispered in her ears louder than any denial. He hadn't moved her for her safety, he'd moved her out of the way. That night, as the halls went quiet and the hum of machines filled the air, Margaret sat awake on her bed. The loneliness that had once felt like fog now hardened into something cold and cutting. She pulled out her old diary, the one she'd managed to slip into her suitcase. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages, landing on one her husband, John, had written years ago before he passed. "If ever the world grows cruel, promise me you'll fight with your mind. Not with bitterness, but with wit. That's how truth wins." Tears blurred her vision. "Oh, John," she whispered. "They took our home. They took everything." The next morning, she went to the office to ask about her bank account. The receptionist smiled politely but told her she had no financial responsibilities here. Everything was handled through her son. That was when she knew. Her savings, her pension, even the money John had left, all gone. For days, Margaret withdrew into herself. She stopped going to activity hour. She stopped answering calls. The staff assumed it was depression, the usual grief of the elderly. But inside her heart, something was shifting. A quiet fire building beneath years of gentleness. She began observing people closely. Which nurses handled paperwork? When the mail arrived? How calls were logged? She paid attention to everything, storing it like seeds for a future plan she couldn't yet name. Then one evening, as twilight painted the room in dusky gold, Margaret smiled faintly for the first time in weeks. She remembered something Daniel didn't, something she'd never told him. John had set up a second trust after his illness, one handled privately by their old lawyer, Mr. Whitmore. It had been meant for emergencies only. And this, she thought bitterly, was as close to an emergency as betrayal could get. Margaret closed her eyes, whispering into the silence, "You may have forgotten me, Daniel, but I haven't forgotten who I am." It was the first spark of something dangerous. Not anger, not hate, but purpose. The spark that had kindled in Margaret's heart grew into a quiet, steady flame. She no longer wept at night or waited for calls that would never come. Instead, she watched and planned. Every morning after breakfast, she would walk slowly around the courtyard with her small notepad tucked beneath her shawl. To the nurses, it looked like she was writing poetry. In truth, she was writing down every detail she might need. Phone numbers, staff schedules, the mail clerk's routine, even the names of visitors who came and went. Margaret knew that if she wanted justice, she couldn't act out of rage. Rage was loud and reckless. But wisdom, that was silent, patient, and far more dangerous. It started with a letter. She addressed it to Mr. Whitmore, her late husband's old lawyer. A man she hadn't spoken to in years but trusted more than anyone alive. The letter was careful, deliberate, written in the neat cursive John had once loved. She told him everything. How Daniel had moved her without consent, how the house had been sold, and how she suspected he had drained her accounts. She mentioned the trust, the one John had created for unforeseen circumstances, and enclosed her identification and signature, authorizing Whitmore to activate it if possible. She sealed the letter and slipped it into the outgoing mail herself, pretending to be taking a walk by the nurse's station. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. For the first time in months, she felt alive. Days passed. Margaret waited. She didn't know if the letter had reached him, or if Daniel had intercepted her mail. She had no access to a phone, no way to confirm. Then one Tuesday morning, she received a small, unmarked envelope during mail rounds. Inside was a note written in familiar handwriting. Mrs. Bennet, your letter has been received. Trust provisions verified. Do not worry. Discretion assured. Expect progress soon. Vous. Margaret folded the note with trembling hands, pressing it to her heart. The plan had begun. But fate, as always, loved to test patience. A week later, Daniel finally showed up, his face pale and drawn. He looked around the care home with a faint sneer. Mom, he said flatly. You've been calling people, haven't you? I got a notice from the bank about a security hold. What are you up to? Margaret smiled gently, the picture of confusion. Oh, Daniel, she said softly. I don't even remember what day it is half the time. I'm sure it's just a mistake. He frowned, studying her. You look tired. You need rest. She reached out and patted his hand, eyes warm but unreadable. I am resting, my dear. And thinking. You know, your father always said the mind is the only thing no one can take from you. He scoffed lightly and stood. Well, don't overthink. The home's taken care of everything. You're safe here. Safe. The word rolled bitterly in her mind. That night, she made her second move. She retrieved the small voice recorder she'd hidden inside her memory box. A gift from her husband years ago, meant to record her favorite stories for Daniel when he was a boy. Now it served a different purpose. She turned it on the next time Daniel visited, pretending to be frail and confused. I keep forgetting why I'm here, she murmured, her voice trembling. It's not costing too much, is it? Daniel sighed impatiently. Mom, I told you the house sale covered it. Don't worry about that old place. We already took care of everything. She smiled faintly. The house? Oh, John would have wanted that. He chuckled dryly. Dad's been gone for years. You really think he'd care about a pile of bricks? The recorder captured every word, every ounce of coldness she had once refused to see. A week later, she mailed that recording, along with copies of her signed documents and Daniel's statements, to Mr. Whitmore. The next morning, Daniel received a legal notice. All financial transfers from Margaret Bennet's estate were under review for potential fraud and coercion. Sitting by her window, Margaret watched the gray clouds shift. For the first time since she arrived, she allowed herself a real smile. Quiet, knowing, and dangerous. You taught me well, John, she whispered. The storm has only just begun. The days that followed felt different, lighter somehow, though the air around Margaret still smelled of disinfectant and distant grief. She knew something had shifted beyond the care home's locked doors. The nurses whispered more softly when they passed her room. One of them even smiled knowingly as she handed over the morning mail. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly when she saw the envelope, heavy and embossed with Mr. Whitmore's seal. Inside was a short, precise letter. Mrs. Bennet, legal proceedings have begun. All assets under Mr. Daniel Bennet's name are frozen pending investigation. The secondary trust has been activated in your name, ensuring your independence and protection. Your husband's wishes will now be honored. Beneath those words was a simple postscript. Your late husband was wiser than even he knew. Margaret closed her eyes and let the tears fall silently. After months of humiliation, confusion, and betrayal, she could finally breathe. Her son's greed had caged her, but her husband's love had set her free. A week later, the care home buzzed with unusual activity. 2 men in suits arrived to meet with her privately. They were representatives from the charity foundation that had inherited her former home, as outlined in John's trust. They assured her that a small seaside cottage, one purchased discreetly through the trust, was waiting for her. It was hers alone, no strings, no family interference. Margaret's heart thudded softly in her chest. A better place, she murmured to herself, recalling Daniel's words from that day. At last, a real better place. That same afternoon, Daniel appeared at the home, his face pale, his hair unkempt, his confidence stripped away. Sophie trailed behind him, eyes sharp and furious. They marched straight to her room, the door slamming open. Mom, what the hell did you do? Daniel snapped, his voice cracking. The banks locked my accounts, my name's in the papers. They're calling it elder exploitation. You're ruining my life. Margaret looked up from her chair, her expression calm. I thought you'd be too busy to visit, she said softly. After all, you hardly had time before. Sophie crossed her arms, her face tight with contempt. Don't play innocent. You've gone senile, and now you're turning everyone against us. Margaret studied her son, the same boy who once clung to her hand when he was scared of the dark. But now, the darkness was in him. Daniel, she said quietly, when you took my home, you didn't just steal walls and wood. You stole the place where your father's memory lived. You thought you could bury me and what I stood for. But you forgot something. He glared at her. And what's that? That I was your teacher long before I was your burden. She handed him a small envelope. Inside were printed transcripts, recordings of his own words, his laughter about selling the house, his callous remarks. He froze as he read them. Where did you? I may be old, she interrupted gently, but I'm not helpless. Those words were sent to my lawyer and the press. They'll ensure you're remembered, Daniel, just not the way you hoped. Sophie's face turned ghostly pale. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her heels echoing down the hallway. Daniel sank into the chair opposite his mother, his voice shaking. I never meant to hurt you, he whispered. Margaret looked at him, not with hate, but with the hollow ache of a love betrayed beyond repair. You meant to take everything from me, she said softly. You just didn't realize that what mattered most was never yours to take. He said nothing. When he finally stood to leave, she didn't stop him. Some lessons, she thought, are learned only when there's nothing left to lose. 2 weeks later, Margaret moved into her seaside cottage. It was small, quiet, and filled with sunlight. From her window, she could see the ocean stretching endlessly, waves whispering against the shore. She planted roses by the porch, her husband's favorite, and hung the family photographs on the walls, the only treasures she had kept. Each morning, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, writing letters to a local paper under a pseudonym, advocating for the rights of abandoned elders. Her story, though anonymous, began inspiring others to fight back with dignity, not despair. One evening, as the sun sank into the sea, she whispered to the empty air, "You were right, John. Truth always finds its way home." She smiled faintly, feeling the warmth of peace return to her heart. The waves outside seemed to answer, soft and steady, like a promise fulfilled. He said it was a better place. He just never realized, it was never meant for him. And with that thought, Margaret finally let the past drift away, carried by the tide, into the vast calm of her new beginning.